A man in prison lights a cigarette and writes in a notebook. He begins with, "The morning it all started." Flashback to October. A man named Charles is in a rush preparing his breakfast. His wife, Deanna, checks their daughter's blood sugar. She's diabetic. While eating, Charles helps his daughter with her book report. Charles is on a train when the conductor begins collecting tickets. He realizes he forgot to buy one, and his wallet has no cash. The conductor tells him he'll have to get off at the next stop. A woman named Lucinda offers to pay for his fare. Charles thanks her and says he'll pay her back. They chat and start to enjoy each other's company. Lucinda works as a financial advisor at a firm called Avery Price, while Charles is a commercial executive. When the train arrives, Charles tells her he'll repay her if she's on the same train tomorrow. Lucinda says it's a deal. At work, Charles talks to Winston from the mailroom, who asks help on a baseball quiz from his cop uncle. Then Charles joins a meeting where a client named Susan is unhappy with his proposal. His boss, Elliot, decides to give the account to someone else, which means Charles loses his commission. That night, Charles helps Amy study for a test. He feels sorry for his daughter, who looks weak and is connected to a machine. Later, Charles drinks alone and quietly breaks down. His wife arrives and hugs him. The following day, Charles sees Lucinda again on the train. They talk about their jobs and their lives. Lucinda shows him a photo of her daughter, and they find out both of them are married. At work, Charles opens the Avery Price website and finds Lucinda's profile. He calls the company and asks for her. They later meet for lunch. Lucinda tells him that her husband is always busy and they barely spend time together. One night, Charles wakes up to the sound of his daughter's machine. He rushes to her room and sees her having a seizure. He calls his wife, who quickly gives her an insulin shot. Deanna cries as she holds and tries to warm their daughter. The next day, Charles is having lunch again with Lucinda. He opens up about his daughter's illness. He shares that they had to mortgage their home to buy her dialysis machine. They've tried a kidney transplant 3 times, but her body keeps rejecting it. Now there's a new anti-rejection drug with a 99% success rate, but it's very expensive. They've been saving for years, just waiting for it to be released. Charles calls his wife and tells her he'll be late due to work. Instead, he heads to a bar with Lucinda, and they drink. He kisses her, and outside the bar, they continue their affair. They ride a cab, and while looking for a hotel, Lucinda suddenly tells the driver to stop. She turns to Charles and says she can't go through with it. Charles says he understands, but then they spot a quiet hotel across the street. They exchange a look and smile. At the front desk, the clerk asks if they want to use the hotel safe, but Charles says no. Inside the room, they start kissing. Things get more intimate in bed, when suddenly a man bursts in and points a gun at Lucinda. He takes their wallet and bag, and realizes they're both married. He begins harassing Lucinda, and when Charles tries to stop him, he gets beaten badly. With the gun aimed at her, the man forces himself on Lucinda while Charles lies on the floor, bloody, and later loses consciousness. Charles wakes up and sees Lucinda sitting on the bed, staring into space. He apologizes and says he'll call the police, but Lucinda stops him, scared that her family might find out. They quietly leave the hotel. At home, Charles tells Deanna he got mugged. Deanna says she hates the city and tells him to quit his job and go back to teaching. Charles says it wouldn't be enough to pay for their daughter's medicine. Later, the phone rings. Charles answers and hears the voice of the man from the hotel. He learns his name is LaRoche. LaRoche demands $20,000, or he'll reveal Charles's affair to his family. Charles, with no way out, agrees to pay. One day, Charles visits Lucinda at her office. He insists they report it to the police, but Lucinda refuses. She says if her husband finds out, he'll divorce her and take their daughter. She tells Charles they shouldn't see each other again, and she walks away. Charles notices the receptionist eyeing them and calls her out. That night, Charles looks at his savings spreadsheet. After thinking it over, he decides to withdraw the money. The next day, he heads to the place LaRoche told him. A man named Dexter meets him and brings him to LaRoche. Charles hands over the money. Once they count it, LaRoche punches him, saying that's for canceling his credit card, then walks away. It's now November. Outside the office, Winston sees Charles smoking and shares a story about getting caught in high school for dealing illegal stuff. He talks about his time in prison, where he once had to defend himself by stabbing someone with a sharpened toothbrush. That night, LaRoche calls Charles again, asking for more money. Charles says he's out. He asks how LaRoche got his new number, and LaRoche drops a hint. When Charles checks, he sees it's their home phone. Alarmed, he rushes home. When he arrives, he finds LaRoche chatting with his wife. He's pretending to be one of Charles's clients, and Deanna believes he's there for a business deal. Charles plays along, but when Amy comes downstairs, he panics and tells her to go back up. Deanna introduces Amy to LaRoche, and Charles freezes as he sees LaRoche kiss his daughter on the cheek. He cuts in, saying he's ready to sign the contract. After Deanna and Amy leave, Charles tells LaRoche to get out. LaRoche grabs him by the groin and demands $100,000. He says if Charles pays up, he'll disappear for good. Charles agrees, and LaRoche lets him go. He leaves, and Charles breaks down crying. The next day, Charles meets with Jerry, his lawyer. Jerry says they can't file charges against LaRoche since no police report was made after the hotel incident. Their only chance is if Lucinda speaks up. Charles tells Lucinda, but she still refuses. Then she reveals she had an abortion. She got pregnant from that night with LaRoche. That evening, Charles turns to Winston for advice. Winston tells him he'll deal with LaRoche and scare him away. Charles tries to turn him down, but Winston reminds him of the time Charles didn't report him for stealing computers at work. Charles insists he doesn't owe him anything, so Winston offers to do it for 10 grand instead. The next day, Charles gets a note from LaRoche with instructions on where and when to send the money. He calls the accountant, saying he needs $10,000 for a commercial spot. He then meets with Winston. They drive to the location an hour early. Charles hands over the cash, and Winston shows him an unloaded gun to use for intimidation. He also gives Charles a handmade knife, the same one he used to defend himself in prison. As Winston explains the plan, a sudden gunshot rings out. Winston collapses, dead. LaRoche had shot him, and he takes the money from Winston's pocket. He blames Charles for what happened, then walks away. Charles wipes the prints and runs. When he gets home, he realizes Winston's knife is still in his pocket. At work, the accountant asks for the commercial spot receipt. Charles says he'll give it later. Just then, Detective Franklin shows up and tells him that Winston was killed the night before. Charles acts surprised. Franklin says Winston was close to him. He's the police uncle Winston once mentioned. He then asks Charles where he was that night. Charles says he was working late, and Franklin asks if anyone can confirm it. The phone rings, cutting the talk short. Charles answers, it's LaRoche. He says he has Lucinda and threatens to kill her. He also warns that Charles's wife and daughter will be next if he doesn't meet him in 20 minutes. Charles agrees to give him the money, and LaRoche tells him the address. Charles rushes out. He withdraws $100,000 from the bank and heads to the address, Lucinda's apartment. Inside, Dexter is pointing a gun at her. Charles hands LaRoche the money. After intimidating him, LaRoche leaves, saying he won't show his face again. Lucinda apologizes that Charles had to give up the money meant for his daughter. Charles says what matters is that she's safe, and so is his family. Then he walks out. At a bar, Franklin finds Charles. He tells him the bartender remembered seeing him with Winston not long ago. Franklin asks again where he was the night Winston died, since no one at the office could confirm it. Charles says he was alone. Franklin lets it go but invites him and his lawyer to his office. Before leaving, he warns that whoever killed Winston will face the consequences. One night, Deanna sees Charles drinking. He breaks down and confesses, the money saved for Amy's treatment is gone. Deanna cries and asks what he's done. She says it took them 7 years to save. Charles finally tells her everything. Later, Charles and his lawyer Jerry head to the station, but Charles says he needs to talk to Lucinda first. They go to Avery Price, and Charles asks the front desk about her. The receptionist says Lucinda just came in, but Charles replies that it's not her. He's referring to the woman he saw earlier in the lobby. The receptionist explains that woman was a temp named Jane, and she already left last week. Charles, now puzzled, returns to Lucinda's apartment, only to learn it was recently rented by a couple who already moved out. When the agent hands him a brochure, he notices the photo. It's the same picture Lucinda once claimed was her daughter. Charles goes to the station and spots Lucinda. He follows her, ready to confront her. But before he can, a man walks up and starts chatting with her. He seems to be her next target. Charles keeps trailing them until he sees Lucinda meet up with LaRoche, and she kisses him. Then Dexter shows up, and the three of them walk away together. Charles returns to the hotel and checks in. His lawyer reminds him that if LaRoche gets caught, the money won't be returned. It would be kept as state evidence. But Charles says he has to handle it himself because he needs the money back for Amy. Later, Lucinda and her latest target check into a hotel. Dexter, pretending to be hotel security, slips some money to the front desk. When LaRoche arrives, we see that Charles has been following them from behind. While the couple waits by the elevator, Charles takes the stairs to the top floor. He gets there ahead of them and hides inside his room. After Dexter leaves, Charles grabs a lampstand and steps out. As LaRoche is unlocking the door with a keycard, Charles knocks him out with the stand. He grabs his gun and carries LaRoche into the room. The man inside panics, and Charles tells him he's been set up. Lucinda pretends not to know what Charles is talking about, but Charles explains how their scam works. She finds a man on the train, acts kind, shows a fake photo of her daughter, and then LaRoche robs the victim. The man usually keeps quiet to protect Lucinda. LaRoche regains consciousness and mocks Charles, who punches him and demands his money back. Lucinda urges LaRoche to just return it so they can go, but LaRoche refuses. The frightened man grabs at Charles's gun. It goes off and hits Lucinda by mistake. Dexter hears the shot and tries to force his way in. LaRoche pulls out a hidden gun and shoots the man several times. When he sees Lucinda hurt, he becomes furious and aims at Charles, but he's out of bullets. Dexter finally breaks in, but Charles grabs his gun and shoots LaRoche. Then Dexter attacks Charles, and during their struggle, Charles grabs LaRoche's weapon and shoots Dexter down. When the police arrive, Charles is back in his room. He tells them he heard gunshots and saw the hotel guard run into the room. So, he locked his door and hid. The officer thanks him for the report and leaves. Detective Franklin shows up and learns that the gun found at the scene is the same one used in Winston's murder. Another officer concludes that the couple was mugged. The guard tried to step in, and it ended in a shootout. As police clear out the hotel safe, Charles spots his briefcase. He shows his ID, and after checking the tag, they hand it over. Inside is the money that LaRoche and Lucinda stole. The next day at work, Charles finds Elliot and the accountant waiting. Elliot accuses him of taking the $10,000 meant for the commercial. Charles says it was an emergency and he planned to return it. Elliot says they've already reported it, but if he pays it back, the worst he'll get is community service. Now it's December. Charles goes to prison where he's serving community service as a teacher. While checking notebooks, he notices one labeled sidetracked. He opens it and reads the first line, "The morning it all began." It tells the whole story, starting from the train, to discovering the con, all the way to the hotel shooting. At the end, it says, when Charles finished reading, he walked to the laundry room. Charles leaves the classroom and heads to the laundry area. There, he hears a voice saying Charles never checked if he survived the hotel. When Charles gets closer, he sees it's LaRoche. LaRoche pins him against the wall and says he ended up in the wrong prison. But Charles replies that he chose this prison. A makeshift knife slips from his sleeve, and Charles stabs LaRoche repeatedly, until it's over. As Charles prepares to leave the prison, he runs into Detective Franklin. The detective asks what happened. Charles says he went to the restroom and the guy jumped him with a knife. Franklin knows that it was Charles who brought the knife. However, he hints that Winston finally got justice. He lets Charles go. Charles smiles and walks away. Back home, he's welcomed by his wife. They watch their daughter, now looking much healthier, as she runs off to catch the school bus.